So I will try. I will try very hard to not do any spoilers. At the beginning of the film, they had a great big thing about saying, please don't do any spoilers because people who want to see this film want to see it exactly as you're seeing it, not knowing anything about it. So in order to do that, I will just tell you the basic setup and I'll try and avoid sort of specific plot points beyond that, okay? Obviously, if you want to know nothing at all, then see the film first and listen to this, but I will go out of my way not to do anything spoiling. So Avengers Infinity War. Essentially, Thanos, who is this evil tyrant who is hell-bent on a mission to destroy half of all the life in the universe, and to do this, he needs to gather together the Infinity Stones, which were sort of there at the beginning of the Big Bang and being scattered around. He has a glove into which the Infinity Stones will be fitted, and these will enable his powers. And in order to stop him, a huge range of characters from different, from the universe, but from different movies that we've seen, all must put aside their differences and come together to stop him in his quest. I think that's pretty much what I'll say about the plot. Here's a clip.
Tell me his name again.
Thanos. He's a plague, Tony. He invades planets, he takes what he wants, he wipes out half the population. He sent Loki. The attack on New York, that's him.
This is it. What's our timeline?
No telling. He has the power in space stones. That already makes him the strongest creature in the whole universe. If he gets his hands on all 6 stones, Tony...
He could destroy life on a scale hitherto undreamt of.
So, there we go.
So a bit like Lord of the Rings, really.
Okay. The first thing to say is that everything about this movie is absolutely enormous, from the size of its cast to the sort of, the breadth of the canvas upon which it's playing out, to the size of the, the conflicts and the battles, to the scope of what's at stake, and also, it has to be said, to the length of its running time and the projections of its box office. It's directed by the Russos, who I think do a pretty good job of taking something in which you have such a vast expanse and reining things in and making sure that what you have all the way through are elements that you can follow, elements that you can connect with, story elements that will make sense. Now, the first thing to say is that I think it's important to understand that there will be 2 different responses to the film. One of them will be from people who are absolutely fans of the world, of the universe, and of the characters. And the other one will be from people who aren't. And we've talked before about whether or not you think a movie has to accommodate both kinds of audience. And I think that one of the things that is both a strength and a weakness of Avengers Infinity War is that it does play, as far as I can tell, most strongly towards the fans, towards the devotees. I came out of the movie, and afterwards I had a conversation with Jack Howard, who's a fellow film critic, much younger than me, and Dean and his friends, and they all really, really liked it. They had really, really enjoyed it. And I've had a similar response from my teenager who grew up with the Avengers movies and has a huge amount invested in them and really, really enjoyed them. And I think that what they like about it is that, firstly, it's taking the world seriously, it's taking the story seriously, it's taking the elements seriously. There is a lot of humor. I mean, as there always has been in the in the Marvel films. You do get a lot of nice interplay between Iron Man and Spider-Man, and between Star-Lord, and you get this kind of that sort of bickering that they do in between the action episodes, and that stuff always works very well, particularly in the stuff with Spider-Man and Iron Man. That's the stuff that I've always sort of really liked in this universe. You do get that, but you also get a sense that there is a serious, huge, big thing happening towards which we are all kind of moving. So you do get that sort of sense of seriousness. However, I did feel that when we came out of the movie that we had very different experiences of it. One of the comparisons may be to, if you think about a film like, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, or you think about movies which sort of divided audiences. What became clear is that although we both thought the same things about the film were interesting and admirable, our emotional responses were very, very different. The people who were real fans of the universe had completely bought into it, and there were several moments in it in the screening that I saw in which people whooped and cheered and gasped and were really properly emotionally engaged. And I know this wasn't just at the screening that I saw, because I know for a fact that at a screening last night in Southampton, a paying audience, did exactly the same thing. So I know that it's a film that is working with its audience. I have a very different experience of it, in that I really did feel that I was watching a film in which what I wasn't was emotionally engaged in the way that the core audience would be. And as a result of that, I ended up seeing a lot more things that I found problematic than they did. And I think it's really important to say, particularly when you're talking about this kind of genre of film, that so much of it is to do with where you're coming from in terms of, your relationship to the characters, your relationship to the franchise. That is a really big part of it. So the first thing is, I think as part of the world and as part of the franchise, it's done a really good job. It's done that job really well. I mean, it's brought together an extraordinary number of elements, and it's put them together in a film which is very long. I know to that core audience didn't feel long, and has very clear through lines, takes risks that they didn't expect, does things that they did expect and did want, but also twists and subverts them in ways that they didn't, thrilled them, excited them, worked as a film. I had the following reservations about it. The first one is that tonally, I felt that sometimes the jumping between the light and dark felt a little bit like channel hopping. It felt like I was kind of flipping between different channels which were working at different registers, and occasionally the registers didn't work together. So the interplaying of the quipping and the underlying narrative sort of seemed to me to be at odds. That said, I do think in the central character of Thanos that there is a really admirable sense, not only of menace and all the rest of it, but also they've managed to inject elements of pathos and things that you wouldn't necessarily expect from that kind of character. So the light and dark sometimes worked, but not always for me. Secondly, whenever you have a story which has this many stories going on, because essentially what you're not talking about is a group coming together, you're talking about lots of disparate groups coming together and then, crisscrossing with each other. Whenever that happens, you always run the danger of losing the thread of one particular narrative or another. And I did feel that there were moments when, we were checking in here, we were checking in there, in which the two things weren't, and I wasn't being emotionally carried through. The third one is more sort of complicated, and it's to do with consequences. It's to do with one of the things that fantasy films always have to deal with is the seriousness of consequences. That if you have a fantasy movie, if you have a world in which you have any form of alternate reality or anything that moves away from physical, one of the things that the filmmakers have to do is to convince you that things that happen in this world have consequences, have irreversible consequences, because that's the kind of dramatic weight of any situation. And I think that's always a battle. I mean, it's interesting if I think, for example, about, I've just been making a television program, this is slightly off the thing, but about time-traveling movies. And one of the things that we've talked about is La Jetée, which of course is the basis for 12 Monkeys. And one of the reasons I love La Jetée is that La Jetée is a movie about time travel, but it's actually a movie about the immutability of time. It's a movie that begins and returns to the same point. And what it is that during its narrative, you just see that same point from a different perspective. You've seen 12 Monkeys, so you know the story of 12 Monkeys is a remake of La Jetée.
Yeah, a long time ago.
No, but it's a film that begins and ends at a certain point. And I think it deals brilliantly with that idea that the world that you're in may be flexible in ways that you wouldn't expect, but actually is inflexible. And this is an idea that Kurt Vonnegut explored. And certainly when you're talking therefore about any fantasy universe, the thing that you have to do is you have to make it feel consequential. You have to make it feel like there are great emotional and physical things at stake. And I have to say that I lost that. I didn't feel that. I know that's partly something which is sort of built into the DNA of the source material itself anyway. But I did feel myself, I was reminded of that, the Ben Wheatley thing about what you actually want is the dang of somebody getting their fingers trapped in a car door, something that is tangible and real and definite, as opposed to great big larger things that may not be as consequential and may not be as as hard and fast. The fourth one is this thing that I call the Live Aid factor. You may love Queen, you may love Status Quo, you may love David Bowie, but I guarantee you that you wouldn't go home and think, I'll put on the Live Aid DVD. What you'd do is you'd you'd listen to your favourite Bowie album or your favourite Queen album. And it's usually the case that if you have a number of elements, number of characters brought together, the thing is actually less than the sum of its parts. And there is always that. Now, I think that in fact one of the things that the film does quite well is it does manage to balance the fact that it's a super group assembly. There are so many different characters going in, but I do always have that feeling that for me, as an outsider to this, I mean, I've seen all the films, but I've never been that deeply emotionally invested in them. I've always sort of preferred the single narrative, the smaller result, the path less trodden, as opposed to the huge race. And then that brings me to the fifth thing, which is the running time, which is that because what I was lacking was that central whoosh, that central rush of emotional engagement, I did feel it was an exhausting watch. So to summarize, I think for what it is, it's very good. I think it does what it does very well. And I think if you're a fan of those movies and if you're invested in those characters, you'll really be knocked out by it, because I think you'll find that it does things that you don't expect. And I think you'll find that it takes risks that you don't expect, and that it's adventurous, and it is very, very well put together. I think if you're outside of that world like me, and if you lack that central emotional connection, you will struggle with all of those things that I've said, which I hope that I've said without giving away any. I don't
think you've given anything away.
Okay, well there we go.
I think you've danced.
And the final thing I'd like to say is this.
Yes.
Blade Runner 2049 was a very long film, and I didn't think it was. Many people didn't like Blade Runner 2049. Many people thought Blade Runner 2049 was boring and slow and ponderous, and I didn't. So bear in mind, the reservations that you're getting are from somebody who watched Blade Runner 2049 and thought, that, to me, is a movie that's the length it should be. And so therefore, bear that in mind with any of the criticisms that I make. That's where I come from. I'm the guy who grew up with 2001 and Silent Running and Solaris and, that sort of stuff. And I'm the guy who thought that Blade Runner 2049 was exactly right. And the other thing that's interesting about that, sometimes I get criticised. People say, oh, well, you only like films because they politically agree with you. Well, in the case of this, that's completely the opposite is true. I mean, as we've known from all the correspondence, the politics of Blade Runner 2049 are much more problematic. But it's a film that works, that resonates with me in a way that this didn't. But that is more, I think, to do with the disconnect between me and it than anything else. If you're a fan, it's the movie that you want.
Does that make it your fault or its fault?
It's not a fault. What I'm trying to do is
the problem with you, or is the problem with?
No, I don't think there is a problem. What I'm trying to do is to honestly describe the experience of seeing it, because it would be very easy to say, yeah, I absolutely loved it. It was really great fun. I didn't, but that doesn't mean that I'm not aware that for its core audience, it absolutely works, and it does do things that are unexpected.